It always starts the same way. A quiet knock at the door, almost hesitant, like a child unsure of their welcome. On the other side stands a pair of children, always two, rarely more. They seem normal enough at first glance. Maybe they're dressed a little oddly, their clothes a bit outdated, their skin a little too pale. They speak politely, asking for help, sometimes for a ride or to use the phone. Their requests are simple, reasonable even. But there's something about them, something that sends a chill crawling up your spine, and then you see their eyes, black, deep, soulless pits that seem to swallow light. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness staring back at you. That's when the fear kicks in, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct tells you to run, to slam the door, to do anything but let them inside. Because deep down, you know that if you do, something terrible will happen. The black-eyed children, they've become a modern urban legend, whispered about in late-night forums and shared in campfire tales. But for the people who've encountered them, they're more than just a story. They're a nightmare come to life. It was a cold autumn evening in rural Vermont when Jenny first heard the knock. She was alone, her husband working the night shift, her kids at a friend's house. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as she settled in with a book. When the knock came, she ignored it at first, assuming it was just the wind. But it came again, louder this time, more insistent. Curious and a little annoyed, she got up and peeked through the curtain. Two children stood on her porch, a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been older than 10 or 11. Their heads were bowed, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hoodies. Jenny hesitated. Something about them didn't feel right. But she was a mother, and they looked like kids in need. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. The girl looked up first. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "We need to come in," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Jenny's heart raced. The boy raised his head next, and that's when she saw their eyes. Black as coal, empty and lifeless. It was the kind of darkness that didn't belong to this world. Jenny slammed the door and locked it, her hands trembling. She didn't sleep that night, and when she told her husband what had happened, he didn't believe her. But Jenny knew what she saw, and she wasn't the only one. Stories like Jenny's aren't uncommon. People from all over the world have reported encounters with the black-eyed children. The details vary, but the core elements remain the same. They appear suddenly, often in isolated areas or during quiet nights. They ask to come inside, but never force their way. It's as if they need permission, like they're bound by some unseen rule. And always, their eyes are the giveaway: black, empty, and utterly unnatural. But who or what are they? That's the question that keeps people up at night. Some believe they're ghosts, the restless spirits of children who died tragically and can't move on. Others think they're demons, using the guise of innocence to lure their victims. Then there are those who say they're extraterrestrials, hybrids created in secret experiments. Theories abound, but no one knows for sure. There's one thing all the stories agree on: letting them inside is a mistake. In the rare cases where people have done so, the consequences have been chilling. One man in Texas reported a visit from the black-eyed children late one evening. Feeling sorry for them, he invited them into his home, only to feel an overwhelming sense of dread the moment they stepped inside. His pets cowered in fear, and his electronics began to malfunction. The children sat silently, their heads bowed, until they suddenly stood and left without a word. The man was hospitalized the next day with symptoms of severe radiation poisoning. It's the kind of story that's easy to dismiss as fiction, a modern-day ghost story for thrill seekers and skeptics alike. But the sheer number of accounts, combined with the consistency of the details, makes it harder to ignore. Are these stories the result of mass hysteria, the power of suggestion? Or is there something darker at play as the legend of the black-eyed children grows? So does the unease surrounding them. Are they a warning? A sign of something worse to come? Or are they simply what they appear to be: children, lost and seeking shelter. But somehow wrong. Tonight, as the sun sets and the world grows quiet, think about Jenny, about the knock on her door and the fear in her chest. Think about the countless others who've heard that same knock, seen those same eyes, and lived to tell the tale. Then ask yourself, what would you do if the black-eyed children came to your door? It was the winter of 1996 when Brian Bethel, a journalist from Texas, had his now famous encounter with the black-eyed children. It was a quiet night in Abilene, and Brian was sitting in his car, parked outside a movie theater. He was writing a check by the dim light of his dashboard when a sharp knock startled him. He looked up to see two boys standing outside his window. They looked normal enough, at least at first glance. The older boy, who seemed to be around 9 or 10, was the one who spoke. He told Brian they needed a ride to their house to grab money for the movie. His tone was polite, but something about his voice felt off. The younger boy stood silently, his face turned downward. Brian felt a chill creep over him, an unease that he couldn't explain. As the boy continued to talk, Brian found himself fumbling for excuses. He didn't want to let them in, but he couldn't figure out why. They were just kids, weren't they? And then he saw their eyes. Two pools of black stared back at him, devoid of light or life. Brian's heart pounded in his chest, a primal fear washing over him. The boy's polite tone turned sharp, demanding. "We can't come in unless you let us," he said, his words clear and forceful. Brian threw his car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot. As he looked in his rearview mirror, the boys were gone, as if they'd vanished into thin air. That night, Brian wrote about his experience, sharing it with a small online community. He had no idea his story would go viral, sparking a wave of similar accounts from all over the world. Brian Bethel's encounter, one of the earliest documented cases of the black-eyed children. It set the stage for the legend as we know it today, with many of the details in his story polite requests, eerie persistence, and, of course, the black eyes becoming hallmarks of the phenomenon. But what is it about these stories that gets under our skin? Perhaps it's the children themselves. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of children as harbingers of fear. We're conditioned to see them as innocent, vulnerable, and in need of protection. The black-eyed children turn that expectation on its head. They weaponize innocence, using it as a mask to hide something sinister. Then there's the matter of their eyes. Throughout history, the eyes have been seen as windows to the soul. Black eyes, devoid of whites or irises, suggest a soul that's absent or something darker. In every account, the eyes are the turning point. It's as if they pierce through the thin veil of normalcy, revealing the true nature of the entity before you. But why do they appear? And what happens if you let them in? Some believe the black-eyed children are an omen, their presence a warning of death or disaster. Others think they're entities feeding on fear, growing stronger with each encounter. Theories range from demonic to extraterrestrial, each more chilling than the last. One account from rural Pennsylvania suggests an even more disturbing possibility. In 2008, a woman named Elaine reported a visit from the black-eyed children late one stormy night. She heard a knock at the door and opened it to find two children, a boy and a girl, standing on her porch. They were soaked from the rain, their heads bowed. "May we come in?" the boy asked, his voice soft but firm. Elaine hesitated, but the storm and their small, fragile appearances tugged at her heart. She stepped aside, letting them in. The moment she closed the door, everything changed. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the air had been sucked out. Her cats, usually friendly, hissed and ran to hide. The children sat on the couch, silent, their heads still bowed. Elaine asked where they were from, but they didn't answer. It wasn't until the boy lifted his head that she saw their eyes black, empty, and soulless. Elaine's fear turned to panic, but before she could react, the girl whispered, "They're here." A loud knock came from the back door, followed by another at the window. Elaine screamed, running to lock every entrance. But when she returned to the living room, the children were gone. The knocks stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving Elaine shaken and alone. In the days that followed, Elaine fell gravely ill. Doctors couldn't explain her symptoms: weakness, nausea, and what she described as a burning sensation under her skin. She recovered eventually, but the experience left her with lingering questions. What had she let into her home, and what had she narrowly escaped? Stories like Elaine's add another layer to the legend. The black-eyed children aren't just creepy visitors, they're harbingers of something darker, something that leaves a mark long after they're gone. Whether it's illness, misfortune, or an uncheckable fear, their presence seems to linger, a shadow that refuses to fade. As we piece together these encounters, a pattern begins to emerge. The black-eyed children don't force their way in, they ask, they wait. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of all: they rely on you to open the door. The stories keep coming, from small towns to big cities, from quiet neighborhoods to remote cabins. The black-eyed children have been spotted everywhere. It's as if no place is truly safe. Yet, despite the growing number of encounters, there's still no clear answer to the most pressing question: who or what are they? One chilling theory suggests they're not children at all, but something masquerading as them. This idea isn't new. Throughout history, folklore and mythology have been filled with tales of beings that mimic human forms to lure victims. In Celtic legend, there are the changelings, fairy children left in place of stolen human infants. In Japanese folklore, the eerie are spirits that take on deceptive forms. Could the black-eyed children be modern manifestations of these ancient stories? Consider the account of Mark, a delivery driver from Colorado. It was late one evening, and Mark had just finished his last drop-off for the night. As he drove down a winding, deserted road, his headlights illuminated the figures standing by the side. A boy and a girl, no older than 10, were waving him down. Mark pulled over, rolling down his window, just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" he asked. The boy stepped closer, his face partially hidden by his hoodie. "We need a ride," he said flatly. "Our parents are waiting." Mark felt an unease settle over him, the kind that doesn't make sense but demands attention. The boy's voice was strange, too monotone for a child. The girl remained silent, her face turned downward. Then the boy stepped closer, and Mark saw his eyes, black, endless, and wrong. Mark's heart pounded as he fumbled to roll up the window. The boy placed a hand on the glass, his voice growing louder, more insistent. "You have to let us in. We can't come in unless you let us." Mark hit the gas, his tires screeching as he sped away. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, Mark hit the gas, his tires screeching as he sped away. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, the children were gone. He didn't stop driving until he reached his home, his hands still trembling as he locked every door and window. For days afterward, Mark felt watched, though he never saw the children again. Encounters like Mark's raise an unsettling possibility. The black-eyed children aren't just asking for help, they're testing boundaries. Their persistence, their strange behavior, and their chilling mantra, "You have to let us in," suggest an intent that goes beyond mere deception. But what happens if you do let them in? The answer remains elusive, and perhaps that's for the best. Another theory ties the black-eyed children to extraterrestrial activity. Stories of black-eyed beings aren't limited to Earth, they appear in countless reports of alien encounters. Witnesses of UFO sightings have described seeing humanoid figures with black, featureless eyes, eerily similar to the children's. Could they be hybrids, the result of experiments blending human and alien DNA? Or are they scouts, sent to observe us, to test us? This theory gains traction when you consider the technology malfunctions often reported during encounters. Phones stop working, lights flicker, radios buzz with static. It's as if their presence disrupts the electromagnetic field around them. For some, this is evidence of something otherworldly. For others, it's just another layer of fear. Take the story of Rebecca, a nurse from Nevada. She had just finished a late shift and was driving home through the desert when her car suddenly stalled. As she tried to restart it, she noticed a figures approaching from the shadows. A boy and a girl, their clothes oddly formal, as if they'd stepped out of another time. Rebecca felt a wave of unease as the boy knocked on her window. "We need a ride," he said. His voice was calm, almost robotic. Rebecca refused, shaking her head and avoiding their gaze, but they didn't leave. Instead, they stood there, motionless, their faces obscured. Finally, Rebecca looked up and froze. Their eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the darkness around them. Her heart raced as she locked the doors and frantically tried to restart her car. The children didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, watching. When her car finally roared to life, Rebecca sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The children were gone. That night, she dreamed of them, their black eyes staring at her from the shadows of her bedroom. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. Rebecca's encounter left her shaken, but unharmed. Yet the memory lingered, a reminder of how close she'd come to something she couldn't explain. Stories like hers fueled the theory that the black-eyed children aren't of this world. But if that's true, then what is their purpose? Are they here to observe, to test, or to take something from us? Perhaps the scariest theory of all is that we'll never know. The black-eyed children remain a mystery, their true nature hidden behind those dark, lifeless eyes. They leave us with more questions than answers, and maybe that's the point. Because in the end, fear thrives on the unknown. The stories seem endless, yet they never fail to chill. Whether it's a knock at the door, figures appearing on a lonely road, or children asking for help, the black-eyed children always bring the same overwhelming sense of dread. But why is it that these encounters leave such a lasting impact? What is it about them that gets under our skin and refuses to let go? Part of it lies in the psychology of fear. The black-eyed children tap into something primal, something deep in our collective subconscious. Children are supposed to be symbols of innocence, purity, and vulnerability. They evoke a natural instinct to protect. But when that symbol is corrupted, when children become the source of fear, it creates a sense of unease that's hard to shake. Imagine hearing a knock at your door late at night. Your first thought might be concern: who's out there? Are they in trouble? But as soon as you see those eyes, the narrative changes. That initial instinct to help turns into an overwhelming need to protect yourself. It's not just fear, it's betrayal. The very image of innocence has been twisted into something horrifying. This psychological manipulation is part of what makes the black-eyed children so effective as a modern legend. They don't need to hurt you physically. Their mere presence is enough to shake you to your core. Take the story of Kevin, a security guard working the graveyard shift at a small office building in Indiana. It was a quiet night, the kind where time seems to stretch endlessly. Kevin was making his rounds when he heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. He froze, his flashlight scanning the corridor. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady but uneasy. No response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came a soft knock, 3 gentle raps on the glass door at the building's entrance. Kevin approached cautiously, his hand resting on the baton at his side. Standing outside were 2 children, a boy and a girl. They didn't look lost or scared, just out of place. Their clothes were plain but clean, their faces pale and emotionless. "We need to come in," the boy said. His voice was calm, too calm for a child out alone at this hour. Kevin's unease grew as the girl lifted her head, her black eyes catching the light from his flashlight. Kevin felt his chest tighten, a cold sweat forming on his brow. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to not open the door. The boy knocked again, harder this time. "Please let us in, we need to come in." Kevin backed away, muttering an excuse about calling the police. When he turned to grab his phone, the footsteps returned, louder, echoing behind him. But when he looked back at the door, the children were gone. He checked the security cameras later, hoping to reassure himself that it was just his imagination. But the footage showed nothing. No children, no knocks, nothing. Kevin quit his job a week later, unable to shake the feeling that he'd narrowly escaped something terrible. Kevin's story highlights another chilling aspect of these encounters: the way they blur the lines between reality and imagination. The black-eyed children don't just frighten you in the moment. They leave you questioning what you saw, what you felt, and what might have happened if you hadn't followed your instincts. Another reason their legend endures is the consistency of the details. Across countless stories, certain elements repeat: the quiet knock, the polite requests, the unnatural calm, and, of course, the black eyes. This consistency lends credibility to the accounts, making it harder to dismiss them as mere fabrications. But what if there's something more to their behavior? Some theorists suggest the black-eyed children are testing us, probing for weaknesses. They don't force their way in. They ask for permission. And in doing so, they exploit our curiosity, our compassion, and our fear. It's a tactic that mirrors other supernatural and paranormal phenomena. In vampire lore, for instance, the creature cannot enter a home without being invited. This need for permission creates a psychological trap. By the time you realize your mistake, it's already too late. Could the black-eyed children be following a similar rule? And if so, why? What is it about crossing that threshold that gives them power? These questions linger, unanswered, fueling the unease that surrounds their legend. Perhaps that's why people can't stop talking about them. The black-eyed children aren't just a story. They're a puzzle, a mystery that refuses to be solved. They challenge our perceptions of reality, of safety, and of trust. They remind us that sometimes, fear doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to exist. And so the stories continue, each one adding a new piece to the puzzle, each one leaving us with the same haunting question: who or what are the black-eyed children? It's strange how fear can linger, even long after the moment has passed. Encounters with the black-eyed children don't just frighten, they leave a lasting imprint, an unease that never fully fades. For those who've seen them, the question isn't just about what happened in the moment, it's about what might happen next. One story that continues to haunt those who hear it is that of a man named Greg, a truck driver from New Mexico. Greg was used to long nights and desolate highways. He'd spent years navigating empty roads, the darkness broken only by the glow of his headlights. He'd seen strange things on those roads, things he couldn't explain, but nothing like this. It was a quiet night, with no other cars in sight, when he spotted the figures standing on the shoulder of the road. They looked small, vulnerable. Children, he thought at first glance, but something felt off. Their posture was too still, their presence unnatural. Still, he slowed down, rolling down his window as he pulled up beside them. "Are you kids okay?" he asked. The taller one, a boy, stepped closer, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hoodie. "We need a ride," the boy said, his voice calm but unnervingly cold. Greg hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to drive away, but he couldn't ignore them. They were just kids, or so they seemed. Before he could respond, the boy stepped closer, and the beam of Greg's headlights caught his face. His eyes, black, lifeless, and wrong. Greg's hand moved to the gear shift instinctively, ready to drive away. But the boy spoke again, his voice louder this time. "We can't come in unless you let us." Greg didn't wait to hear more. He hit the gas, his truck roaring as he sped down the highway. In his rearview mirror, the children didn't move. They just stood there, watching as he disappeared into the night. For days after, Greg felt a strange heaviness, as if the encounter had drained something from him. He couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, or the feeling that he'd narrowly avoided something terrible. Stories like Greg's raise unsettling questions. Why do the black-eyed children appear in such isolated places? Are they drawn to vulnerability, to people who are alone and far from help? Or is it the quiet of these locations that allows them to manifest, free from the distractions of crowded cities? Theories about their origins abound, each more chilling than the last. Some believe they're spirits of lost or abandoned children, doomed to wander the earth in search of a home. Others think they're demons, using the guise of children to prey on human compassion. And then there are those who suggest a more scientific explanation: extraterrestrial hybrids, experiments in genetic manipulation gone wrong. One particularly eerie account comes from a woman named Sarah, who encountered the black-eyed children outside her apartment in Chicago. It was late, almost midnight, when she heard a knock at her door. She peeked through the peephole and saw two children standing in the dimly lit hallway. A boy and a girl, their heads bowed. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible through the door. Sarah hesitated. Something about them didn't feel right. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're lost," the boy replied. "We need to call our parents." Sarah's hand hovered over the doorknob, her instincts warring with her sense of compassion. That's when the girl lifted her head, and Sarah saw their eyes black as night, void of life. She stumbled back, her heart racing, as the boy knocked again, harder this time. "We can't come in unless you let us," he said, his voice growing firmer. Sarah locked the door and grabbed her phone, dialing the building's security. When she looked through the peephole again, the children were gone. Security found no trace of them, despite the hallway being monitored by cameras. The footage showed Sarah opening her door slightly, but nothing else. No children, no knocking, nothing. The encounter left Sarah shaken, questioning her own sanity. Encounters like Sarah's highlight the surreal nature of the black-eyed children. They don't just defy explanation, they challenge our understanding of reality itself. How can so many people report such similar experiences, yet leave behind no physical evidence? Are these entities real, or do they exist in a realm beyond our perception, slipping into our world only when the conditions are right? Some researchers suggest they're interdimensional beings, crossing over from another plane of existence. This theory could explain their strange behavior, their need for permission, and their ability to disappear without a trace. If true, it raises even more unsettling questions. What do they want, and why do they come to us? The stories continue, each one adding to the mystery, each one leaving us with more questions than answers. But one thing is certain, the black-eyed children aren't going away. They remain in the shadows, knocking on doors, waiting for someone to let them in. The black-eyed children seem to exist at the intersection of fear and fascination. Their very nature defies explanation, and their encounters are almost designed to leave us questioning reality. But perhaps what makes them truly terrifying is the way they prey on our most human instincts: our desire to help, our need to understand, and our fear of the unknown. Consider the story of a young couple, Tom and Lisa, who lived in a quiet suburb in Oregon. It was a typical Saturday evening, and they were settling in to watch a movie when they heard a knock at the door. It wasn't unusual, but something about the sound seemed off. It was too soft, too deliberate. When Tom opened the door, two children stood on the porch, a boy and a girl, both wearing outdated clothes that didn't quite fit. The boy spoke first, his tone polite but unnervingly monotone. "Can we come in? We need to use your phone." Tom hesitated. It was late, and the kids looked out of place. But Lisa, standing behind him, felt a pang of sympathy. "They're just kids," she whispered, urging him to let them in. As Tom stepped aside, the boy looked up, and Lisa gasped. His eyes were black, completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness. The girl looked up next, revealing the same soulless eyes. Lisa pulled Tom back, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. From inside, they could hear the children knocking again, louder this time. "Let us in," the boy demanded, his voice now cold and forceful. Tom and Lisa backed away from the door, their hearts racing. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. When they finally looked outside, the children were gone. The couple spent the rest of the night in fear, unable to shake the image of those black eyes. The next morning, Tom discovered strange handprints on their door, too large for children, yet too small for an adult. They never found an explanation, but the encounter left them shaken and wary of any late-night knocks. Stories like Tom and Lisa's are unsettling because they tap into universal fears strangers at the door, the loss of control, the unknown lurking in the dark. But what happens when these encounters go beyond fear and into harm? Some accounts suggest the black-eyed children are just observers but bringers of misfortune, illness, and even death. Take the case of Paul, a widower living alone in a rural farmhouse in Kansas. One evening, as he was preparing for bed, he heard a knock at his door. He ignored it at first, assuming it was the wind. But the knocking continued, steady and insistent. When he opened the door, a young boy stood on the porch, his head bowed. "Can I come in?" the boy asked softly. Paul, feeling uneasy, asked where his parents were. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he raised his head, and Paul saw his eyes black as coal. Before Paul could react, he felt a sudden wave of nausea and dizziness. His vision blurred, and he stumbled back, slamming the door shut. The boy didn't knock again, but Paul's health deteriorated rapidly in the days that followed. He developed an unexplainable illness that left him bedridden for weeks. Doctors couldn't find a cause, and Paul couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had something to do with it. These stories paint a picture of entities that don't just inspire fear, but leave a lasting mark on those they encounter. Whether it's physical illness, psychological distress, or an unshakable sense of dread, the effects of their presence seem to linger long after they've disappeared. Some researchers have drawn comparisons between the black-eyed children and other paranormal phenomena, like shadow people or men in black. These entities share common traits. They appear suddenly, often in isolated areas. They interact briefly with humans, leaving behind confusion and fear. And they seem to exist outside the normal rules of our reality. What connects these phenomena? Are they manifestations of the same force, taking different forms? Or are they separate entities, each with its own purpose and agenda? Theories abound, but concrete answers remain elusive. What's clear is that the black-eyed children challenge our understanding of the world. They blur the line between the physical and the supernatural, leaving us to question what's real and what isn't. And perhaps that's their greatest power, not just the fear they inspire, but the doubt they leave behind. Because in the end, the scariest thing about the black-eyed children ain't what they do. It's what they make us feel. The unease, the questions, the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, the next knock at the door won't be so easy to ignore. If you've ever heard a knock late at night, if you've ever felt the hairs on the back of your neck rise for no reason, then you know how it feels to brush against the unknown. The black-eyed children are a reminder that fear doesn't always come from what we can see, it comes from what we can't explain. What would you do if they knocked on your door? Would you open it? The black-eyed children seem to operate on a pattern, one that's both familiar and deeply unsettling. They knock, they ask, they wait. But what happens when the pattern changes? What happens when the encounter isn't just eerie, but potentially dangerous? Consider the story of Mia, a college student who lived alone in a small apartment near her campus in Washington. It was a rainy evening, the kind that made staying in feel like the best option. She just settled in with a book when there was a knock at the door. It startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late. At first, Mia ignored it, assuming it was someone at the wrong apartment. But the knocking continued, slow and steady. Reluctantly, she approached the door, her heart beating a little faster than usual. Looking through the peephole, she saw two children standing in the dimly lit hallway. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 or 11, their clothes slightly too large, as though they were borrowed. "Can we come in?" the boy asked when Mia opened the door, just a crack. His voice was calm, but there was something off about his tone, something that made Mia hesitate. "Are you lost?" she asked, glancing at the girl, who remained silent with her head bowed. "Do you need help? We need to come in?" the boy repeated, more firmly this time. Mia's instinct screamed at her to shut the door, but her curiosity held her in place. That's when the girl looked up, and Mia saw their eyes. Black, void of light, staring at her with an intensity that froze her in place. She slammed the door and locked it, backing away as the knocking grew louder and more insistent. "Let us in," the boy shouted, his voice no longer calm but commanding. Mia grabbed her phone and called campus security, her hands trembling. By the time they arrived, the hallway was empty, and there was no sign of the children. For days after, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in her peripheral vision, and she often woke up in the middle of the night, certain she'd heard footsteps outside her window. Though the children never returned, their presence lingered in her mind, a reminder of how close she'd come to something she couldn't explain. Encounters like Mia's are rare, but not unheard of. Most stories about the black-eyed children follow a predictable pattern: polite requests, eerie persistence, and the overwhelming sense of dread. But every so often, the pattern breaks, and the stories take a darker turn. One account from a man named Carl suggests the black-eyed children may not always travel in pairs. Carl, a retired mechanic, was staying in a cabin in the woods of Maine when he had his encounter. He was chopping firewood late one evening when he heard movement near the tree line. At first, he assumed it was a deer or some other animal, but then he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a child, a boy no older than 10, dressed in an oversized jacket that hung awkwardly on his small frame. The boy didn't speak or move closer. He just stood there, watching Carl with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "Are you lost?" Carl called out, but the boy didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as though studying Carl. The longer Carl looked at him, the more uneasy he felt. It wasn't until the boy stepped into the light that Carl saw his eyes black, empty, and wrong. Carl dropped the axe he was holding and backed toward the cabin, locking the door behind him. He peered through the window, but the boy was gone. For the rest of the night, Carl heard knocking at the doors and windows, though he never saw the boy again. What makes these stories so terrifying isn't just the encounters themselves, it's the aftermath. Many who've come face to face with the black-eyed children report feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. Some experience lingering illnesses or strange misfortunes, as though the children leave behind more than just fear. This lingering effect raises an unsettling possibility. Are the black-eyed children feeding off the fear they inspire? Do they gain something from these encounters, even if they're denied entry? If so, what happens when someone does let them in? Theories about their true nature continue to evolve. Some believe they're manifestations of shadow people, entities that exist in the periphery of our reality, feeding on negative emotions. Others think they're interdimensional beings, crossing over into our world to observe or interact with us. Then there's the idea that they're simply echoes of something darker, spirits or demons that have taken on a form meant to manipulate and deceive. What's clear is that the black-eyed children don't fit neatly into any one category of the paranormal. They're not ghosts, not aliens, not cryptids. They're something else, something that defies explanation and challenges our understanding of the world. And perhaps that's what makes them so terrifying. They don't just haunt the people who encounter them, they haunt all of us, forcing us to confront the limits of what we can explain. Because in the end, it's not just the knocking on the door that's scary. It's the question that follows. What happens if you let them in? Not every encounter with the black-eyed children ends in a moment of terror. For some, the fear begins subtly, creeping in slowly like a shadow that refuses to leave. It's the kind of fear that lingers in the corners of your mind, waiting for quiet moments to resurface. And sometimes, the effects go beyond the encounter itself, leaving behind physical, emotional, or even spiritual scars. One such story comes from Claire, a teacher from Michigan, who had her experience late one snowy evening. Claire lived alone in a modest house near the edge of town. She was used to the solitude and even found comfort in it. That night, she had just finished grading papers when she heard a soft knock at the front door. At first, she thought it might be her neighbor, needing help with something. But when she opened the door, she saw a young boy standing alone on her porch. He was wearing a thin jacket, entirely inappropriate for the freezing weather. His head was bowed, and his shoulders were hunched, as though he were trying to shield himself from the cold. "Are you lost?" Claire asked, her voice full of concern. The boy shook his head slowly and spoke in a quiet, almost robotic tone. "Can I come in? I need to call my parents." Something about his voice unsettled her, but she chalked it up to the unusual situation. She was about to invite him inside when he raised his head, and her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were black, completely black. No whites, no irises, just an endless void staring back at her. Claire froze, her instinct screaming at her to shut the door. But the boy stepped closer, his voice growing firmer. "Let me in. I can't come in unless you let me." She slammed the door and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. For the next hour, the boy continued to knock, sometimes softly, sometimes forcefully. Claire stayed in her bedroom, clutching her phone and waiting for the police to arrive. But when they did, the boy was gone, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow. In the days that followed, Claire began to feel strange. She described it as a constant heaviness, as though she were carrying an invisible weight. She grew tired easily, and her once bright home seemed darker somehow, as if the light didn't reach the corners. She developed a persistent headache and a nagging sense of being watched, though she never saw anyone near her house. Claire's story is not unique. Many who've encountered the black-eyed children report similar after-effects illnesses with no clear cause, feelings of dread, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. It's as if the children leave behind a piece of themselves, a lingering presence that can't be shaken. These accounts add a new layer to the mystery. If the black-eyed children are simply entities seeking entry, why do they seem to affect people even when denied? Some theorists believe they're feeding on fear, drawing energy from the emotions they provoke. Others suggest their presence disrupts the natural balance of a space, leaving behind a residual energy that lingers long after they've gone. But what if the effects are more deliberate? What if the black-eyed children aren't just feeding on fear, but planting something, an idea, a curse, or even a piece of themselves within the people they encounter? One chilling account from a man named Alex suggests this might be the case. Alex had his encounter while camping alone in the woods of Washington state. He awoke in the middle of the night to find two children standing just outside his tent. Their silhouettes were barely visible in the moonlight, but he could hear their voices soft, almost whispering. "Let us in," one of them said. "We're lost." Alex's first thought was that they were hikers who had gotten separated from their group. But when he unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight on them, he felt his stomach drop. Their eyes were black, and their faces were unnervingly calm. He zipped the tent back up and refused to respond, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until he finally shouted for them to go away. When he unzipped the tent again, they were gone. In the weeks that followed, Alex began having strange dreams, visions of the children standing at the edge of his bed, their black eyes watching him. He woke up each time drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The dreams grew more vivid, more invasive, until he could barely sleep. He described it as though they were trying to pull him back into their world, a place he couldn't see, but could feel on the edges of his consciousness. Alex's story raises a terrifying question. What do the black-eyed children want? Are they simply trying to enter our homes? Or are they trying to enter something deeper, our minds, our souls, our sense of safety? The mystery of their purpose is what makes them so haunting. They don't just exist in the moment of the encounter. They linger, in dreams, in memories, in the spaces where fear thrives. And perhaps that's the scariest part of all. They don't need to touch you to leave a mark. They only need to be seen. Imagine hearing a knock at your door in the dead of night. Would you open it? Would you invite them in? The black-eyed children remind us of the thin line between curiosity and danger, between what we know and what we fear. How far would you go to uncover the truth, or to protect yourself from it? The longer you delve into the stories of the black-eyed children, the more unsettling they become. These aren't just random encounters, they follow a pattern that feels deliberate, almost ritualistic. The knocks, the requests, the black eyes, and a chilling sense of dread all point to something far more calculated than mere coincidence. What's particularly disturbing is how many of these encounters take place in moments of vulnerability. Whether it's someone home alone, driving down an empty road, or camping far from civilization, the black-eyed children seem to appear when you're at your most isolated. It's as if they're drawn to weakness, to moments when you have no one to turn to but yourself. Take the case of David, a factory worker from Alabama, who encountered the black-eyed children while driving home late one night. David's shift had run overtime, and it was well past midnight when he finally got on the road. The stretch of highway he took was long and desolate, with no other cars in sight. About halfway home, David noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. They were children, a boy and a girl, both dressed in simple, outdated clothes. At first, he thought they might be hitchhikers, but the sight of children in such an isolated area sent a wave of concern through him. Against his better judgment, David pulled over and rolled down his window. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice cautious. The boy stepped closer, his head still bowed. "Can you give us a ride?" he asked softly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. David felt a chill creep up his spine as he glanced at the girl, who hadn't moved. "I don't think I can," David replied, his instincts telling him to drive away. But before he could roll up the window, the boy lifted his head, and David saw his eyes black as ink, staring back at him with an intensity that froze him in place. "You have to let us in," the boy said, his voice growing firmer. "We can't come in unless you let us." David hit the gas, his tires screeching as he sped away. He didn't look back until he was sure he'd put miles between himself and the children. But even then, the fear didn't fade. For weeks after, David couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He avoided that stretch of road entirely, though he never saw the children again. Encounters like David's raise questions about the nature of the black-eyed children. Are they opportunistic, appearing when people are vulnerable? Or do they create the conditions for their appearances, manipulating reality in ways we can't understand? One chilling theory suggests they're not just feeding on fear, but planting seeds of something darker. Their request for entry, their insistence on being let in, could be part of a ritual or process that gives them power. If that's true, then every encounter, every knock at the door, every polite request could be a test, a way of probing the boundaries of our reality. This theory gains weight when you consider the number of people who report strange dreams or illnesses after encountering the black-eyed children. It's as if the encounter doesn't end when they leave, it stays with you, growing in the shadows of your mind. Take the story of Rachel, a nurse from California, who encountered the black-eyed children while working a late shift at her hospital. Rachel had just finished her rounds and was heading to her car in the empty parking lot when she saw two children standing near the entrance. A boy and a girl, both dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked out of place. "Can you help us?" the boy asked as Rachel approached. "We need to get home." Rachel hesitated, her instincts warning her to keep walking. But the children looked so small, so vulnerable, that she couldn't ignore them. She reached for her phone to call security. But the boy spoke again, his voice sharper this time. "We need to come in." When Rachel looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Their eyes were black, soulless voids that seemed to pull her in. She stumbled back, muttering an excuse as she hurried to her car. The children didn't follow, but their presence lingered in her mind long after she drove away. In the weeks that followed, Rachel experienced vivid nightmares of the children standing at her bedside, their black eyes watching her as she slept. She woke up each time in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The dreams grew more intense, more invasive, until she began avoiding sleep altogether. Rachel's story adds another layer to the mystery. If the black-eyed children are capable of entering our dreams, what else can they do? Are they limited to the physical world, or can they influence us on a deeper, more psychological level? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing is clear: the black-eyed children, not just an urban legend. They're a phenomenon that defies explanation, leaving behind a trail of fear and unanswered questions. And perhaps that's what makes them so terrifying, their ability to exist in the spaces we can't fully understand, to slip into our lives and leave us wondering what might happen next. The mystery of the black-eyed children isn't just about what they are, it's about what they represent. They challenge our understanding of reality, tapping into our deepest fears and making us question what lies beyond the world we know. And yet, despite the countless stories and encounters, we still don't have answers. One of the most unsettling aspects of the black-eyed children is their persistence. They don't force their way into your home or car. They wait, calmly, patiently, as if they know something we don't. Their repeated phrase, "We can't come in unless you let us," is more than just a request. It feels like a test, a challenge to see how far human curiosity and compassion can be stretched before fear takes over. But why? Why do they need permission? And what happens if you give it? In rare cases where people have allowed the black-eyed children inside, the aftermath is often catastrophic. Take the story of James, a middle-aged man from Vermont who encountered them one snowy night. James lived in a cabin deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. He was used to the quiet, to the isolation, but that night, the knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, two children stood on the porch, a boy and a girl, dressed in thin clothing that seemed out of place for the freezing weather. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, his voice calm and steady. James hesitated, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. But the children looked so small, so vulnerable, that he couldn't bring himself to say no. He let them in. The moment they stepped inside, James felt a shift in the atmosphere. The room grew colder, and the light from his fireplace seemed to dim. The children didn't speak again. They sat silently on his couch, their heads bowed. James offered them blankets, hot drinks, anything to make them comfortable, but they didn't respond. Then, slowly, they looked up, and James saw their eyes black, endless voids that seemed to drain the life from the room. His chest tightened, his breathing grew labored, and a wave of panic washed over him. Before he could react, the children stood and walked to the door, opening it without a word. They left, disappearing into the snowstorm as suddenly as they had arrived. In the weeks that followed, James fell gravely ill. Doctors couldn't pinpoint the cause, and no treatment seemed to help. He described a constant feeling of weakness, as though something had been taken from him that night, something he couldn't get back. Stories like James's suggest that letting the black-eyed children inside is more than just a mistake. It's an invitation to something far darker. But what is it they take? Is it energy, health, or something even more intangible like a piece of the soul? These questions linger, unanswered, haunting those who hear the stories. But perhaps the scariest question of all is this: why do they keep coming? What is it they're looking for, and will they ever stop? Theories about their true nature are as varied as the stories themselves. Some believe they're demons, preying on human compassion to gain access to our world. Others think they're extraterrestrial hybrids, testing humanity's reactions to their presence. And then there are those who suggest they're something entirely different, entities from another dimension, beings that exist on the edges of our reality. Whatever they are, the black-eyed children remain one of the most enduring mysteries of the paranormal world. They don't just frighten, they leave us questioning the very nature of reality. And perhaps that's why their legend continues to grow, drawing us in with each new story, each new encounter. As you finish this video, think about the countless accounts of the black-eyed children. Think about the fear, the uncertainty, and the lingering question that haunts every story. What would you do if they came to your door? Would you let them in? Fear thrives in the unknown, and the black-eyed children are a perfect example of that. Their mystery, their persistence, Their unnerving eyes, all of it leaves us questioning what's real and what's not. But one thing is certain, the next time you hear a knock at your door, you'll think twice before opening it. What would you do if the black-eyed children came to you? Share your thoughts, your fears, and your theories in the comments below. Let's explore this mystery together.